just like to thank everybody for joining us at this busy time of year. My name is Greg Murray, and I'm the Director of Life Planning at El Segundo, or at the Smart School in El Segundo, and I'm also the Chair of the Data Trends and Analytics Committee. Today, I'm pleased to welcome you to Season 3 of DTA Today. Our first episode will explore institutional research, how to move towards purposeful data collection in independent schools. I'm joined by Ariel Blumberg, who is the co-chair of DTA Today and a wonderful partner in this. So thank you for being here. And we'll also be joined by 3 data gurus who are going to share their experience as data managers in different sectors of education. First, we have Amada Torres, the Vice President of Studies, Insights, and Research at the National Association of Independent Schools. In this capacity, she conducts original research and produces reports on national studies of interest to NAIS schools. As a permanent contributor to the NAIS Trend Book, she regularly speaks on issues related to independent education, trends affecting independent schools, financial stability, admissions, and marketing and advocacy. Our next panelist is Eric Heilman, who has been working in independent schools in the DC area for over 15 years, the latest 12 at Maret, where he is the upper and middle school math teacher and upper school grade dean. Over the last few years, he has transitioned into the role of Director of Institutional Research at Maret, where he administers all standing feedback surveys, performs data analysis, designs interactive visualizations for the leadership team. At Maret, he also leads the Center for Institutional Research in Independent Schools, a national network of institutional research practitioners reaching over 150 schools across the country. Funded by the E.E. Ford Educational Leadership Grant, CIRIS provides free professional development for data enthusiasts, ranging from technical skills to fostering a healthy data culture in schools. He's also a senior IR strategist for consulting firm Mission and Data. Our final panelist is Allie Levey, Director of College Counseling at Maret School. Allie began his career in admissions at Wesleyan before founding the College Counseling Department at an open enrollment public charter, serving all first-generation student body in the New Orleans Recovery School District. Allie later served as the upper school admissions director at Sidwell Friends in Washington, D.C., the director of college partnership at the Center for Student Opportunity, and an associate director of college counseling at Green Hill Schools in Ann Arbor, Michigan. So thank you so much. We have a wealth of expertise in the Zoom room today, and I'd love to get started with our first question. So we live in a data-driven world, and families choose to enroll their students in independent schools, and they regularly expect us to have data accessible to us, to have good data infrastructure. But in my experience and that of many others, we don't quite always have that. So why do you think it is that despite having robust data, very little is actually done with it? And why don't we start with Amada?
Thank you, Greg, for the question. I think that there are many reasons for that. As you said, we live in a new landscape where we are inundated with tons of information, but sometimes the definitions of our roles might not have been initially seen as needed to analyze data and information. So maybe there is a gap between the abundance of information with the skills that we in general have in our schools. But also that might be intimidating for some people who were not brought up in calculations or using spreadsheets or other analytical tools, and it might be overwhelming. But the new challenge also is that all these new volumes of data are coming from different sources, text, pictures, etc., that is unstructured, meaning that it's not easy to capture or quantify, and also is not centralized. That's something that even at NAIS, we struggle sometimes with that type of information. We have information from DASO, we have information from our CRM, and then we need, platforms to talk to each other. So that requires some behind the scenes extra work. So a last thing that I will mention, and I noticed that this is very particular to our industry. When we talk about independent schools, we really like to be independent. And by that, what I mean is we tend to think that what we want to do has to be done in our own terms, or our context really define what we want to do. So it's difficult to get consensus in terms of variables to track, in terms of definitions. No, and as you can imagine, it's also making a little bit difficult to conduct a benchmarking analysis or even comparison analysis. So what I see is that even on traditional surveys like parent satisfaction surveys or surveys among students, we have several and different questions included, definitions, and something that you might even think like basic information like definitions around race and ethnicity. I was talking with a school in San Francisco, and they were telling me, do you think that it makes sense that we don't have any more African American students in our school? So I was thinking, oh, maybe you have an issue with attracting kids from that group, right? And they told me, no, we have them. It's just because we think they all are multiracial. So we're not including them anymore under African American. But so-and-so, a different person in the school, I think it was a diversity practitioner, she was arguing that, no, you should put them as African Americans. And I said, well, the new way to track that is multiple choice. So they can still, right, be identified if they self-identify as African American and maybe Hispanic or white, right? And then you can do that type of analysis and identify how many of those kids were checking more than one box. But even conversations like that might be tough for some of our schools.
Great. Eric and Allie?
Yeah, so I'd say on the ground, like in schools, first of all, thanks for having me. It's good to see everybody. When we think about the way schools are structured and organized in terms of offices, the way we've traditionally done data collection is really pragmatic. Each office is collecting data to accomplish a certain task. And so for admissions, we're going to decide who to let in and who to get financial aid to. Academically, it's like, we need to produce report cards and transcripts. And so that's the data that we've been collecting. And as long as, people have been accomplishing that, which they have, successfully for a long time, there hasn't been really a thought or imagination about, how else might this information be analyzed, because people don't always have that background, and how can this be connected? And certainly in the past, even 10 or 15 years, the capabilities for exporting data from these big systems that we have has increased. And so it's only recently that data has been extractable. And while we are still struggling with, as Amada said, getting our systems to talk to each other, if you're on like Ravenna and admissions and Veracross and your student information system, like merging that data about a single student can still be challenging, but at least we can get the data sets out. So I think that part of the reason that data is so siloed is because our organizations are siloed, and people who are usually the main collectors of data are not always connected to sort of what we call at CIRIS data strategy. And so some of the most successful models I've seen in schools that are de-siloing that have what they call a data governance committee, or some sort of committee that involves both the people that are collecting data from a pragmatic way, but also somebody from the tech office who is keeping an eye on like, how are we storing it in a way that we can merge it later? And then somebody who's doing an analytics role who is sort of there to help guide, are we collecting the right data that is actually going to be leverageable later on?
I think I would only add very small details to this. I think that there's also some of the very pragmatic, which is, I think all of us experience in these schools especially, there rarely ever seems to be the right moment in time to begin a project in response to what data is sharing. So that may sound like it's just kicking the can down the line, but I do feel that's a real problem in independent schools, certainly. And I think that what we're trying to do at Maret, and I think many schools across the country, are to try and find very clear moments to de-silo, to evaluate what's happening, to potentially think about pilot or more than pilot opportunities to put into action some things to respond to some of the pieces that the data may show require our action and greater thought in future and successive years. And I think that we have to be willing to do that. And I also think too, there is a knee-jerk discomfort in these spaces too, especially when viewing data may illuminate that this might actually be a personnel concern on the adult side of things. And if it's revealing those kinds of trends and themes, that can also be difficult to manage and then to create a plan as a fuller group of faculties to move forward on. And I just think that those are some of the things that I see as well.
Great, thank you. So Eric, you sort of alluded to this, but I want to dig a little bit deeper into this question. So we have platforms like Naviance, Score, Maya Learning, Slate, Blackbaud, Canvas, Ravenna, School Admin, and Razor's Edge across all the different sectors of our independent school. And that might be something, yeah, I forgot somebody, I'm sure. But how do schools move beyond just collecting this data and move towards synthesizing it and utilizing it in the day-to-day of the school?
Yeah, so I think one of the things we encounter most at CIRIS is just helping people to expose people to what's possible to do. So a lot of schools, they may not have seen some of the dashboards that other schools have out there. And so they don't know that this is something that they can even do, right? Because let's be honest, we're all consumed with getting the stuff on our job description done. And so, to think about, oh, wait, what else is out there, is often sort of at the bottom of the priority list. And so at CIRIS, one of the things that we've really been trying to do is, we get a lot of people coming to us that are asking the same question, like, how do we start on this? What's even out there? And so what has been some of the funnest times for me is connecting people and being like, oh, you have to see what X school is doing. It's phenomenal. And they come and, see a demo, or they see it at a conference and they're like, whoa, you can do that. And so that's really where, once people see what is possible and the impact it can make, they get really interested in it. And so there is, that is often the spark to start thinking about, okay, well, how do we get there? And then that's when we dig into, okay, here's X, Y, and Z that you have to do in order to start merging your data. And honestly, the data wrangling on the back end is some of the most difficult work. And that's why we always say it's just crucially important to have a strong relationship with your IT department. And in many schools, the IR person is in the IT department. So there's a lot of different ways that schools organize the beginning of the work, and who's doing what. And any model, well, not any, but most models can be successful depending on where the competencies lie already in your school community.
Great. Eric, do you want to, or Allie, do you want to share a little bit about how Eric's work is influencing what you're doing in your department? The conversation we had yesterday was so robust and got me eager to try to do what you're doing and start integrating that into our school community.
Greg, I want to thank you for saying that. I felt the same. It was an awesome conversation. Certainly just reinforces what Eric is saying, that we all need to spend more time in this community of educators because we can share and benefit from one another's experiences. I guess I'll be a little less polished and professional here and say, Eric, I really want to talk very directly about my own college counseling feedback dashboard. Do I have your go ahead? Eric is, of course, the rock star of this show, as you'll understand. But here's how we use it. I got together with this incredible person on my team who's now, of course, running CIRIS, Eric, and I worked with him to develop a couple questions that we wanted to be the rock of the surveys that we would be collecting data on that would show our college counseling, based on our college counseling values and processes and policies, what we are or are not accomplishing on the various fields that we'd like to evaluate ourselves. So Greg, I hope this is in line with what we talked about yesterday. So a couple of the things that we put together, and I'm like to talk about it and potentially even show it. I believe I can share a screen. Is that correct? Yes, everybody? Okay. I think I can. Well, maybe I can in a second, maybe. But essentially, the feedback dashboard that I have allows me to look at a couple data points. And the ones that we created were, did we present useful resources generally to our families? We have families and students respond to all of these. Did we actively and effectively consider identity when creating a list? Did we provide? Yep.
I think you can share now.
Oh, thank you so much for that. Appreciate it. Can everybody see this okay? Great. So this is what this looks like for me and my team. And Eric can also help me fill in some of the pieces because he is the design behind this. But essentially, I got to look through, and I look through every year, the feedback that our families are providing us and students to determine how we are or are not meeting our goals around some various pieces that are the pillars of our work. So example, I'll just toggle, did our college counselor presented useful resources to guide our search process, 1 to 10. You can see down here averages related to various student demographic things that we can capture and parent demographics that we can capture. Again, in the spirit of sharing across this network of people, some of these are obviously some concerning metrics. They then bring up some very real conversations that have to be had, not only within my department, but across the rest of the upper school leadership team about what we are or not doing. I think what it also does, and Greg and I talked about this at length yesterday, is it forces me to do a little bit less of something we can do in small schools typically, which is say, oh, well, that's just one kid. Well, you know what? It may just be one kid, and that actually requires some contemplation and action after the fact. And so again, I think I just want to show a couple others, provided regular and timely reminders about meetings, deadlines, and procedures throughout the process. I thought this one was particularly important for us to be looking at. When thinking about which schools would be a good fit for my child, the college counselor encouraged us to consider a range of identifying characteristics, including but not limited to my child's race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, gender identity, sexual orientation, and learning profile. And I can't tell you how important these feedback points are for us in the next year's worth of work we're doing, how we're thinking about providing professional development in and among my team of 3 counselors. And I think also that's the other piece I'd say that this dashboard really helps. And I'm sorry, I will stop in a second. As a manager of many college counselors in my community, there are 3 of us and a registrar. This also gives some really important feedback that I can then bring towards not only myself, which I do, but also to my colleagues to think about what are better ways that we could be serving various needs in our school. And then easy ones like, oh, we are generally getting lower marks about things like financial aid programming. Well, guess what? We really need to dig in to do better next time.
I would just to tag on what Allie said, I think certainly these kind of dashboards, whether it's college counseling or in other areas, definitely can and do illuminate some things you want to work on. I would also point out that this is also showing a lot of strengths. And so a lot of times when people think about data, they immediately jump to it's going to show things that we need to work on, which is true. But as part of the data culture development, I always encourage schools to also spend some time on those dark greens. There's a lot of stuff that you're doing super well, that is important to publicize to people to build the data culture. The data culture is not just about, finding flaws. It's also about identifying strengths and what's going well.
Thank you. And I appreciate that, Eric. Yes, there's some sort of sadistic line of maybe this work generally that allows me just to just narrow in on the red zones of this data.
I assure you, it's every office in every school I've run into. So you're not alone.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
I don't know what that says about us as a community, but
yeah.
Allie, if you ever get into a jam, you can just change the color to green. It's no problem. The pen can.
That's true. Yeah,
we do not have editing privileges on the dashboard.
Don't have, but there's no, truly. And I think also, though, we use this in tandem, Greg, back to something else we talked about yesterday and what we were saying. Oops, sorry. What we also were trying to use this with SCORE. So Maret uses SCORE. We've used Naviance in the past. So Eric and I are trying to figure out ways to make those systems talk. But also, it also translates into data points we share in our program with families. Perhaps this will be just, I don't know, definitely useful to my counselor colleagues who may be doing senior programming right now. Maybe we were a little bit too intense this year and maybe a little scary, but we did share the following data point this year, which came from the combination of our SCORE data, this data, et cetera, which is that of last year's senior class, the data was about they got into their schools at about a 40% clip. So that was the average acceptance rate for our students. It was about 40% of their list they got into, but close to 85% of that 40% were the schools that we had termed likelies. And so we are presenting that data to future classes and families to also inform some of their search pieces. And so that they see with us that we are really hawking and paying attention to these results on a year-by-year basis.
Awesome.
I would also, if I can just add quickly, another system we have in place that is useful, potentially useful for college counseling is we survey our alums when they're 2 years out and 5 years out. And half of that survey is backwards looking and talking about their satisfaction with where they ended up, and did they transfer at some point? If they transferred, why did they transfer? And so there's also a wealth of knowledge about, it's one thing to think a school is a good fit for a kid when you're sending them out, but it's a different story when you hear back from them, 2 and 5 years out about what their experience actually was. And that it can help schools figure out, are there certain profiles of kids that are coming through that just don't actually end up liking, certain schools. And so there's some interesting pattern making that you can do from that as well.
Great. Thank you both. It sounds like you've got an amazing setup and just keep adding more to it. And I imagine that also probably helps you change the narrative to something a little bit more targeted with your marketing offices to talk about what success looks like beyond just outcomes.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes. Yeah.
Great.
So we have a bunch of stories, what our grads are up to 5 years out. And there's just a giant repository of these really cool things that alums are doing that definitely our admissions office is very interested in, and it helps us figure out things like, do our alums of different genders go into STEM at equal rates? And the answer is yes. So that's really cool.
Awesome. Great. Well, thank you. So we've been talking sort of at the granular level of the high school, but I want to flip it a little bit and talk to Amada and ask, what interesting data trends are you seeing at the national level? And can you describe your work for us a little bit? I know we talked yesterday or the other day about mental health and wellness sort of being at the forefront of a lot of the conversations.
Sure, absolutely. I think that if I would like to start a little bit with the trends in data usage, for instance, I think that across the board, what we're seeing is a lot of interest in leveraging data for the work done across different roles in the school. I'm seeing, like, for instance, this is a typical example, right? When I joined AIS 17 years ago, the head of school was the master head teacher, right? And it was data analysis or acting more like a CEO. It was not really part of the role or the expectation. That has totally changed. Also, admissions people, right? They were considered really good at communicating. Of course, you need to bring prospective families, right? But I'm seeing more and more, even from other organizations, discussions around how can we upskill our own roles around the usage of data and analysis. So that is something that I'm noticed, first, and of course that is linked to all the changes that we're seeing in terms of professional development. In professional development, we're seeing more and more demand about how to leverage data for data analysis, how to work together, as Eric was mentioning, not only within your own community, but also with across the board, like IT folks, admissions folks, and even just in communities of practices, trying to learn from each other. I think that is great that, you guys have this type of events. We try to do a little bit of that, especially in the time of No Child Left Behind, when we were trying to work with schools and share within each other, what type of data they were collecting, that was speaking not only about the student outcomes in terms of performance, but also about where were they later on, what was the impact that our schools were having when students were in college and beyond. So that seemed to work really well. But in recent times, as you can imagine, there is a lot of conversation around data security and so much interest in cybersecurity, how to guarantee that data is stored in the safest way possible. I actually saw an article that said that schools are the second most frequent target of ransomware attacks. So protecting individual information, of course, is key. And an interesting trend that also noticed, especially among larger schools and those with more resources was really discussing the importance of having an institutional researcher, a full-time institutional researcher as part of their team. And I asked Eric when we met, if he was one of the attendees at a meeting that was organized in the Bay Area, where that was actually a conversation, the need for independent schools to really pour more attention, time, and resources into really conducting more data analysis. One last thing to mention is really regarding student wellness. At NAIS, we really realize that when we talk about students, we're talking about the whole child. So we needed to keep that in balance. Students are not only sent to the school because we want them to perform really well, because parents believe that by sending them to our schools, they have more advantages in going to top-notch colleges and universities. But we did a study also, motivations of parents, why they sent their kids to our schools. And believe it or not, the vast majority, was like 40% of our parents, they wanted a balance between challenging their child, but not to the extent where they start dreading going to school and complaining on Sunday afternoon, like, I don't want to go to school tomorrow. And after that group, the other largest group was parents who were saying, like, for whatever reason, the public school system doesn't work for my child. Or my child is having challenges in learning math or reading. And that is not necessarily learning differences. It was just, there was some lack of connect. So that hope of having the individualized attention to my child and make my individual child flourish, it was also another reason why they were sending their kids to our schools. So I know that many people in the role of college counselor, that's one of the things that they know. You are in a position to get to know very well, your students. And many times you are the ones acting as coaches and mentors. So that is a great opportunity, to embrace really that role and see how data can help you to be successful.
Wonderful, thank you. And just to alert everybody in the chat, we just dropped a link. Thank you, Emmy. And that's for CIRIS if you'd like to get some information and see what they're doing as part of that program. And it actually brings me up to my next question, which is perfect timing. So Eric and Allie, you talk about your Thrive model and that data visualization, if you will, as something that informs your day-to-day work in terms of seeing how students are doing, both on academic metrics and well-being. Could you talk a little bit about how that's folded into your experience and your helping your students?
Yeah, so I'd say that's really some of the data analysis work that schools are most interested in these days is around quantifying wellness and also DIJ work and belonging. A lot of schools are wondering, we've got, I haven't seen a school mission yet that says we just want our kids to make A's at this school, and that's what our school is about. Every school mission, has, a whole bunch of stuff in it. And so at Maret, we, a few years ago, we developed a system to quantify how kids are doing in areas that are actually listed in our mission statement. So we do have two areas around academics that we measure. So one is the grades kids are actually making and their sort of objective performance, and then the other is how kids are feeling about their learning, which encompasses a bunch of things. Then we are also tracking dimensions around arts, athletics, social community connection, which involves connections to peers and also club involvement and that sort of thing. And then also physical and emotional health. So in our system, in each of those dimensions, we get feedback from the student, and that's combined with data that we have in all of our systems about what's been going on with the student that semester. And those are combined mathematically to create scores. And each semester, there's a profile for students in each of those areas. So some of the ways that our teams use that is particularly, for example, in our middle school, they'll look at every semester when the scores come out, they'll look at the, physical and emotional health scores and the social and community connection scores, and see, who are the kids in 7th grade that are at the, have the lower scores in that grade. And are these kids already on our radar? 8 times out of 10, they are already on the radar. They're students that, have been being talked about in meetings, and, issues are known. Some of the times those are surprises, and sometimes those surprises are false alarms. Certainly, maybe a kid was just having a bad day, or went on a long vacation to Italy for 3 weeks, and so they have a ton of absences, and that caused their health index to drop down. But there are definitely times when something's really going on with the kid and we didn't know about it. There are some students that feel super comfortable with coming to an adult and talking to them, and particularly in this generation of kids, there are some kids that feel okay submitting on a survey that they're having a rough time and it's not face-to-face with another human. And so that just gives us a sort of an early warning system to help support kids that might need it. It also, our system allows us to aggregate the individual profiles up into any demographic combination we want. So we can look at the average profiles for male students and female students. And that really gives us some institutional feedback about if we see, there's a big gap between male and female students on average on social and community connection, that is something that we can address programmatically. If there's a big gap in terms of wellness, that's something that we can address programmatically. It also informs our DIJ work because we can aggregate up to racial and ethnic groups, and also by gender, to really zoom down on, are there any groups that in the dimension of social and community connection, really there's a huge gap between different groups, and let's pay attention to that. Certainly, our model, we've been working on it for a few years. Other schools are working on similar models. San Francisco University High School, their assistant head of school, Nasif Iskander, has been working on a holistic student experience model as well. So schools are addressing this in different ways that are very cool, and I love hearing about them. But that's definitely an area where people are pushing into, but it requires a lot of pre-work before you get there, because you have to have the data infrastructure, like all the data that goes into the model has to be recorded someplace. You need to unify it across systems. So while the end product is really cool, it's definitely one of those models that takes an institutional commitment to get done.
Yeah, I would only add just one piece, which is that, kind of in a college counseling and in a divisional direction, we really do work with the deans of the various grades. That's the structure of our school. Perhaps many of you on this webinar have a similar one, because we work with the grade deans, especially at the point of assigning college counselors to individual students, to have check-ins on Thrive Index metrics pieces to help inform sort of our beginning conversations with them and their parents, and also to have some background. But I really just wanted to, emphasize what Eric said before and make this stickier. There's currently a senior that we are serving who, by almost all external, anecdotal, grade level observation points, looked like they were having an unbelievable time. And it was actually through the survey data and some of the Thrive score pieces that we started to witness and wonder about how things were actually going for this person on a personal level behind closed doors and after they went home, which then actually allowed us to provide a lot of wraparound support, and certainly not just as college counselors, but bringing in our school counselor and the grade deans as well, which frankly has been truly beneficial and transformative for him.
Yeah, I would just add, I think one of the biggest benefits, I said sometimes there are false alarms and sometimes the model is wrong about a kid. I don't think that's a flaw. I think one of the things that we can fall into most in independent schools, it's sort of our Achilles heel, is having a narrative in our mind about who a student is. And even if it's a false alarm, it does force people to step out of the narrative they have in their mind and really question it. And sort of an outside perspective is something that I think independent schools really need. And a data model, even when it's wrong, can actually prod people to think, wait a minute, is this belief I have actually correct? Is it possible it's wrong? And that is invaluable even in of itself.
Great, thank you. I imagine that probably catches those students that are high flyers that might sort of be suffering in silence.
Yeah, that's Greg. That's exactly what this example was, and there are all numbers of different, machinations of experience that are happening with our kids, week to week, and this though was not just I had a really bad test and then struck out 3 times at the baseball game. This was really revealing about an undercurrent that we needed to support, and luckily we were able to.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So my next question is something that I think I hear the term thrown around a lot: survey fatigue. So you're talking to us about collecting all of this information along with what you're gathering organically at your schools. And Amada, this applies to you as well. How do you avoid that survey fatigue? And how do you build surveys that meaningfully capture the data that you're looking for without just clobbering folks with 150 survey questions?
So I'll say my spiel on this. I think it is possible for survey fatigue to exist. I think it's a much smaller problem than people imagine. I always say that what people get tired of is filling out surveys that apparently go nowhere. So people don't get fatigued of surveys, they get fatigued of not being listened to. So if you're actually doing surveys and reporting back to the people who filled it out about what the results were, and you're explaining what you are doing as a consequence of the feedback you received, people don't get tired of that. Teenagers and kids love to give their opinions. Parents in our community love to give their opinions. I have yet to see a time when they were fatigued of giving their opinions, honestly. I mean, I've been in parent-teacher conferences, so I mean, I have a hard time believing that people are actually tired of giving their opinion. I think they're tired. They feel like this is not an avenue that is where my opinion is valued. And that can be really deadly to a data culture. So I think if schools are actually following up on the surveys and not doing surveys that they know they're not going to do anything about, survey fatigue is a very minimal issue.
Great. And Amada, you are in a different situation. In some ways, DASL is requiring that we provide that data, but then there's also optional surveys and feedback. So how do you navigate that?
Yeah, absolutely. It's very interesting to hear Eric's point of view on this, because I agree. What we are doing is, I think that listening more from what is really needed, because sometimes, in our case as NAIS, sometimes we have all of these questions that we want to get answers, right? But maybe from the perspective of the practitioner, that is not the most important question to ask. So I think that one of the biggest changes that I'm seeing at our organizational level is getting more input on regular basis of what is important to you, recognizing that what is important in New York and New Jersey, which is the region that we call it the East, might not be relevant to the schools in the West, right? In California, Washington State, etc., right? So one of the things that we're doing to show what is the value, right, of participating in our surveys is what Eric was mentioning. We realize and recognize, and we're very grateful for all the time and resources that people spent in entering the data. So the minimum that we can do is to make sure that there are enough outputs on a regular basis that are what people needed. Something else that we do also, especially in my team in research, we conduct more regular, given the current landscape. We also notice that something that vast and comprehensive as DASL might not be released on time, meaning that maybe right now you need information, but you need to wait until the first or second week of November to get access to DASL, right? So that's one of the reasons why, silver lining of the pandemic, we launched what we call the snapshots. And a key element of the snapshot was, first of all, we really think, do we need to ask this question, yes or no, before putting it in the survey? We're trying to be very focused, so we launch, these are once a month, and maybe max 8 questions, right? So it's like under 2 minutes for people. But the key aspect of the snapshot is we always ask them, what is top of mind of you? What would you like us to cover next time? So in a sense, and this sounds like cliche, but at NIS, we constantly talk about co-creating. no, which is, I think, very much in line with what Eric is also saying.
Great. Thank you. Amada, I think a lot of schools are using NAIS data. They're pulling what they can to use as a comparison point against what their school is doing. What do you wish counselors knew about NAIS data or would access more often to help them?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, we collect a lot of data. No, I think that I would like to go back a little bit to what Eric and Allie were mentioning when assessing students by different groups. We have a lot of information for students in terms of their wellness, no, but also information around race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, etc. So understanding what are the differences by these groups, I think, is key. Like just talking about student wellness. We, even if you don't use our own data, I would encourage people to look for alternative, meaning like you have sources on alumni surveys, parent surveys, current students. That's an area where most of the time I think we don't really ask our students how they think we're doing, and that is precious information, right, to do a better job. And I mentioned also earlier to Greg and Eric and Allie, that as we're focusing more and more on student wellness. So please feel free to reach out. We have a lot of information on student wellness now. It's coming also from, of course, from the schools. I think that the advantage is that we also have access to researchers and clinicians who work with public schools or charter schools. So we get a sense of, when talking about benchmarking, sometimes we're just looking inwards, what is happening in our industry. And there is so much to learn from the other type of schools, what is happening beyond the walls of independent school communities. And believe it or not, that's actually how we start to focus more and more on student wellness, because we realize that, hey, our numbers are not that good. Why is that? So being aware of what data is out there and living up to the mission that we all have, right? We're educating the whole child. It's not just the grades. It's also their own well-being. So I think that that's an area where I wish we have more participation and more awareness, that this should be part of what we are also collecting.
Fantastic. So we have a question coming in through the Q&A. So the question is, could the panelists possibly speak on the relationship between institutional research and faculty evaluation and or professional development, making sure that the faculty feel heard and that issues are addressed?
Yeah, so at Maret, one of the things I administer is we do course evaluations twice a year. So for teachers, they're getting feedback from their students twice a year. And so, department chairs go over that feedback with the teachers, and we do one round in the fall, and then in the spring they can see if they, changes they've made in their classes have been effective. So there's certainly a piece of that. We also conversely have a system that we're developing for faculty to evaluate their supervisors. So basically a 360 type situation. Because we were using a 360 form that was extremely narrative heavy. And so because it was kind of a big lift to fill out, very few people would fill it out about their supervisor. And so we've been working on a way to get more voices into the mix of how supervisors receive feedback about their performance, which I think is going to be super great. And because we have somebody in my position, the questions we're asking are all very much aligned. So a lot of the feedback that we are collecting from students about teachers, we're asking questions on the same theme, from faculty about their supervisors. And so there's an ability to sort of align across different constituencies. And then I would say there are schools that do a great job out there of soliciting faculty feedback about, sort of work culture and work climate in general. And some of the best examples I've seen of that, they are doing faculty feedback at least 3 times a year. And faculty are not getting fatigued of that because they also have a faculty voice committee where that group is empowered to really translate and analyze the results from those surveys. And when they sit down with the head of school, every trimester, and the head comes back and says, okay, this is what I've heard from you all. This is what we're going to do about it. And because that's an effective and people can see the impact, they get, phenomenal, engagement with those surveys from faculty. And so that can be, again, it's, survey, report, act. If schools that are doing that, I think have been very successful in, at least hearing what, is on the faculty's mind. Sometimes you can't do anything about it, but at least you can say, I hear you, and here's why we can't do X, Y, or Z.
Just quickly, Greg, I would also add, and this is more from the perspective of someone who works a lot with data and, what I think could happen as well. I think that it's important to have these informal conversations and chats. Is part of gaining the trust of people that you're coming with very good intentions. You're noticing something in the work that you're doing that you might think is relevant to the work of someone else. So don't wait until you have like a red flag over there to share something that you're seeing. Share also all the positive, right? Like, hey, I'm noticing that girls in 7th grade seem to be doing great on X, or some of the positive that you're already seeing, because that helps to build that trust and fosters also collaboration, at least on an informal basis, if that is something that is not happening already formally in the school.
Great. So, Amada, you mentioned trust, and this is a topic of conversation that came up when we were having a chat about this panel. I think, at least in my experience, a lot of staff and faculty and colleagues have been worried that sharing out the data makes you lose control of it. So how do you build this trusting data community in your school and know that you can be transparent with, and as Allie shared, some of the flaws or weaknesses in your department that you need to work on? How do you create that culture so that people feel comfortable participating in it?
Yeah, this is a great question too. And believe it or not, we also have some of these challenges at NAIS. Now, it happens everywhere. It's not only in the schools. But I will go back to what I was saying earlier. For many years, you can imagine, DASO has a team, research has a different team. So we were working in silos, and then we were like looking at the mission of the organization and why we exist. So it didn't make sense for us to work in those silos. So we started to, 2 things we were happening to build that trust, even though that when it was happening, I think that was not really what we had in mind, like, oh, I'm going to build trust with this other team. No, it was just happening because we really needed to do something to work together and be more efficient. But we started to have more informal conversations, like spending some time eating together, sharing some of the things that we were doing. Because something that I noticed is that if we don't have a good understanding of the work of the other person, when it takes them, I don't know, a couple of days to answer one of my questions, my reaction is going to be like, that person doesn't want to share with me the information. What is happening? Why they are not giving me what I need? Don't they realize that is making me be late with answers? Stuff like that. But if you start to understand, like, oh, they are right now really busy working with updating the platform or whatever it is. So it really understanding better the day-to-day of your colleagues puts you in a better position and saying, providing better feedback and really being more clear about how joining forces helps everyone. Of course, your North Star is always the mission of your school, of, in our case, of NAIS, and putting at the center who you're serving. But really, even with in NAIS, in our role, we also evaluate, for instance, the professional development programs and events. Now, so as you can imagine, there was a time where we will write a report, an assessment of the event, and give it to them. Then we were like, nothing was happening. Again, lack of trust. So we started to have informal debriefs. And then we were like, but some of the things that we were recommending are not being taken into consideration. So then we started to join some of their meetings to learn how they operate. And then we realized that, guess what? Some of our recommendations didn't make sense, because the way they were structured, the way or the type of access to information that they had. So we're like, oh my gosh. So the better we started to understand where they were coming from, their responsibilities, what they were trying to achieve, I think that the trust was generating there. And I feel like now in a better place, where even informal interactions, like I read something that I feel like is appealing to or would be interesting and helpful to them. Even these little interactions. Hey, Hillary, I read something about something that I think will be useful for your team. Here you go. So it's not seen anymore like, is there a hidden agenda behind this? Why are you sending me this right now? Generally, the interactions seem to be now spontaneous, and because we are on the same team.
Great. That's wonderful to hear and a great example. So we are coming in on the top of the hour here. So I just wanted to ask one final question, and we'll answer some questions in the Q&A if we have time. But so what is your best advice for counselors taking the leap into the data culture world and maybe getting this going at their school?
Well, I think that my best advice is to spend some time with the people who are going to be designing the system with you, to get some of their expertise, to understand the foundations of what is going to be of course produced and eventually utilized, but then how eventually they'd like to help you think about on the back end putting new activities and actions into practice. And I think that just taking that first step at speaking to real experts around data, if that's not your forte, it was not mine, but also to talk with them and maybe feel a little bit more confident about like the playbook moving forward, that can help you feel more confident in the exercise, feel more confident about how you'll use it, and feel more confident about how you'll explain its work to the students and parents that will eventually be hopefully beneficiaries of your intentional exercise. Yeah.
I would add that I think something that Allie didn't mention, but that he has been phenomenal about, that has really helped grow the data culture in his office, is that, if you're taking this on, and particularly if you're leading an office, to role model, hey, we're getting this data. None of us are perfect. I'm not perfect as a leader. We say this to our students all the time. Students have strengths and weaknesses.
Sure.
Even if they have weaknesses, we don't think they're a bad person. We're going to have this data. It's really going to help us figure out what we're doing well and what we're not doing so well at, what we want to work on, because we can all get better at what we're doing, and we all care about serving our students the best that we can. And then Allie, just as you saw on this call, he's putting out his own data. He's sharing, hey, this is what's going on, and you're like, no, it's not perfect, and that's fine. And we're, that is a piece of data culture that does build trust. People don't feel like, oh, you're only collecting data about them and, you're out to get them. Like when I would share, like when we did course evaluations, I put my own course evaluations up on the screen in front of the entire faculty,
He sure did. Yeah. I was there, and people laughed and applauded and cried. No, laughed and applauded.
Yeah.
Well, all of them were appropriate responses to those course evaluations. Maybe even a little crying. But to role model, like, hey, I'm doing my best, but we all have places where we can grow and develop. I think that is the cultural piece that has to be there in order for any new data system to thrive. And the last thing I'll say about it is that the culture of trust and openness to change exists in a school independent of how much data analysis they're doing, right? So certainly you have to have those to grow a good data culture, but trust and openness to change comes from leadership and role modeling. And it's kind of a prerequisite before you can even get into good data work.
Yeah, I think that vulnerability piece, and thank you, Allie, for sharing your dashboard. It gives me a pause because we're asking our students to be this vulnerable every day and be assessed, and we ourselves are fearful of it a lot of times and hesitant to be exposed to it. So I think we should put ourselves in our student shoes and remember that we're doing this to help them be better, and we should also hold ourselves to the same standard.
And just quickly, Greg,
close us out.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, you don't need to wait to have perfect data systems in place to start with the work. Just reflect on what the key aspects of your role are, and ask yourself, where can I find already information to help me with that? Especially if you feel like you don't have all the resources, that others might have to help with these data systems. And I would also recommend reaching out, because our community is very generous. And in more than one occasion, I have heard that I call so-and-so and that person share with me what they are doing and how they are doing it. We can learn a lot from each other.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, it's time to get back to letters of rec and all of our other duties and gathering all that data we just talked about. So thank you, Amada, Eric, and Allie. We really, really appreciate you taking the time out at this time of the year. As a reminder for our audience, today's session was recorded and will be available on the Access member website following our presentation. And if you are a data wonk and wanting to get involved, please feel free to reach out to me. My information's on the Access website, but we'd love to have more people involved. And I can say from my experience, I am not a data guru, but I'm somebody who's interested in it. And it's fun to bring all of the brilliant folks into the room together to learn. So thank you all. And we wish you the best of luck over the next week as we charge forward to those November 1st deadlines. Take care, everybody, and stay tuned. We're going to have a new episode next month on wellness.